Hey everyone, welcome to Communicating Through Form Lecture 2. Today we're going to be reviewing some of the terms that we learned last week, and we're going to learn we're going to just layer up that vocabulary even further. And we're going to look at it by breaking it into sort of three sections. We're going to look at the elements of design, the principles of design, and lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of Gestalt as it relates to design. Let's start by looking over some basic terms, many of which we've already learned. Most images that you're going to see today are culled from two archives, the People's Graphic Design Archive and the Online Letterform Archive. When you have some free time, both sites are worth getting lost in. Let's start with the elements of design. The elements are the most fundamental basic visual elements that we as designers can use to create meaningful form. Think about these as the fundamental, just the basic words. It's sort of like learning the basic nouns of design, if you will. Person, dog, table, we're just the fundamental words that'll allow you to be able to express through form. Let's start with point. Point marks a position in space. In graphic terms, it takes form as a dot. Points can be insignificant points or flecks or be a concentrated locus of power. Here is part of an invitation for the Architectural League of New York City. This was designed by Massimo and Leila Vignelli. Points can demarcate position or assemble to create complex forms, like a pointillist painting. Here is an example of the blotter prints series by Daniel Eatock. These are artifacts that cross the line between graphic design, fine art, and science experiments. Each one of these is a sheet of blotter paper laid over colored markers that eventually draw the ink from the markers into the prints to create these chaotic and wild series of points. Next up is line. A line is an infinite series of points. It is a connection between 2 points. Lines can be vertical, horizontal, diagonal, curved, spiral, dashed, dotted, gradated, and given many other graphical treatments. Here is a poster and logo type for the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, designed by Pedro Ramirez Vasquez and Lance Wyman. You can see how lines assemble to form a complex texture, ultimately using lines to build the word or in the very center. Or this print by Vincent Perrottet, a poster which utilized an arrow motif to build a complex visual form which leads your eye through multiple layers of space. We've seen point has extended into line, and now we're extending into the full range of 2 dimensions with shape. Shape is the area contained within implied lines. Shapes have 2 dimensions, length and width, and can be geometric or freeform. Here is a poster that utilizes shape designed by Young Sung Chan for the Seoul 1988 Olympics. Or check out this print by Annette Lenz, who uses form and counterform to create layers and shapes of type. From 2 dimensions to 3, we move into volume. A graphical object that encloses a 3-dimensional space has volume. It is a form with width, height, and depth. Space gives the illusion and feeling of depth. In the example shown, we see how 3D graphic renders use space, aka volume, to create a sense of 3-dimensionality. Or this poster constructed out of line and shape to make complex 3-dimensional forms in space, designed by Nancy Skolos and Tom Woodell. Color is one of the most important design elements, as it allows designers to communicate emotions in specific contexts through image. Here are 3 examples of color spaces as they're defined: the hue, value, saturation color space, the subtractive color space, where the more colors you lay on, the brighter it gets. This is the color spectrum that you see from visible light, such as coming from screens or coming from lights. And finally, you have what is known as the subtractive color spectrum, which is the more color that you add, the darker it gets, like when you're mixing ink or paint. Texture. Texture is the surface quality simulated or actual of a piece. texture can be created using the other design elements. Visual textures are representations of touch textures. As a result of printing technology, this is a vibrant and chaotic, but still readable textural surface designed by Ed Ruscha for Orb magazine. Or these prints by the designer Mark McCoy. He uses texture of printed artifacts to create complex creative form. His drawings deploy complexity of line and shape to make dense textural prints. That concludes what we're going to talk about in terms of the elements. Now let's talk a little bit about principles. We've already started to have like nouns in our vocabulary. Let's move on to some of the verbs. The design principles explore the relationships that describe meaning within and between the formal elements of design. Balance is a state of equilibrium in which no single part has a greater weight or presence than another, producing a soothing, peaceful, and non-dramatic result. In the examples shown, we see three different types of balance. Symmetrical, as is the case with this print by Lorraine Wild and Jeffrey Keedy, with the eye motif balanced out almost perfectly with the globe motif. Or this asymmetrical painting or poster by Tadanori Yoko. The symmetrical background is offset by the man in the foreground holding a sword and facing in a singular direction. Or lastly, a radial balance. In this poster, Martin Vinesky builds an implied focal point where everything radiates out of. Proportion refers to the relative size and scale of the various elements in a design. The issue is the relationship between objects or parts of a whole. Playing with proportions is important in a design to lead the eye around it. In the example shown, we see how designers have played with the size of their elements to create visual interest. This is the cover of Emigre magazine. While proportion is used to create a degree of dynamism on the page, it also is used to articulate the hierarchy of meaning between the title of the magazine and the various subject matters contained within. This poster uses scale relationships between proportional elements to create a sense of visual rhythm and melody. Perspective is created through the arrangement of objects in two-dimensional space to look like they appear in real life. Perspective can be achieved through the use of relative size, overlapping, blurring, sharpening, color gradation, and line weight. In this image, a presentation of an interface uses perspective to create various kinds of emphasis. In an early experiment in computer graphics, one-point perspective is replicated through repeating and scaling of elements by Aaron Marcus in the 70s. Emphasis is used to create dominance and focus in a piece. Designers can create emphasis through color, shape, value, type, proportion, perspective, and so much more. In this example, we see another poster by Martin Vinesky. We see that the focal point has been created by playing around the scale, color, and spacing to create an emphasis in the lower right section of the poster. Things get darker, type gets bigger, and there's a greater degree of legibility. Movement is the way designers lead the eye around in and through a composition. Movement in a visual image can also occur when objects seem to be in motion. This principle can be achieved through shapes, forms, lines, and color. In this print by Keitra Dean Dixon, our eyes not only don't follow the specific path that is suggested in entirety, but the very nature of this image carries the eye through a series of movement that it quickly resolves into something meaningful. You'll notice that fact begins in a very rigid black and white steps and eventually leads the eye towards a transition into a colorful and chaotic version of feel. Pattern uses the other design elements in planned or random repetitions to enhance design work. Patterns can be seen as background elements, but also be utilized to create meaning from their perceived sense of perpetuity. Here's a typographic pattern designed by Jan Baker. Or here is the use of envelope security patterns to create a map of the world by Catherine Duffy. Repetition works with pattern to make the artwork seem active. The repetition of elements of design creates unity within the artwork. Peter Baker's accentuated ascenders and descenders give this piece a deep sense of rhythm. Karl Martens uses elements repeated across a grid to create visual forms that have complexity and subtlety. They required a kind of deep looking in order to parse. Rhythm is the repetition of visual movement of the elements, colors, shapes, lines, values, forms, spaces, and textures. Rhythm is about creating a visual dance to your composition, also known as aiding and moving the eye around in a fluid motion. Reed Miles's album covers always operate to make the experience of rhythm and syncopation into something almost literal. Variety provides contrast to harmony and unity. Variety consists of the differences in objects that add interest to a visual image. Variety can be achieved by using opposites or strong contrasts, changing the size, point of view, and angle, color, or tone of a single object. This is part of a large series of prints by Jurg Lenny, where he created a series of interlocking patterns, all roughly at the same proportions, so that colors and different versions of these patterns could be overprinted onto each other to create a randomized pattern. This is the use of form. This is the use of repetition and variety to create a visually interesting piece. Unity means the harmony of the whole composition. Unity is the relationship amongst the elements of a visual form that helps all the elements function together. In the example, we see that there is no true focal point, as no single point is being emphasized. Instead, everything in the two posters that you will see is meant to be experienced as a totality. That concludes the principles that we'll be looking at today. And we're going to round things out with some lessons on Gestalt. Gestalt is a German-originated word. In German, Gestalt means shape or form, and the theory explores how we humans see visual elements. It means an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. Gestalt psychology was founded by Max Wertheimer. He created theories that attempted to describe how people tend to organize visual elements into groups or unified wholes when certain principles are applied. Let's begin with the principle of figure ground. This principle shows our perceptual tendency to separate whole figures from their backgrounds based on one or more of a number of variables, such as contrast, color, size, etc. This illustration on this album cover relies on the ambiguity between the foreground and the background. It begins as white nails on a black background and evolves into black smokestacks on a white background. This is also one of the greatest punk rock records ever. His Hero Is Gone, the plot thickens. Similarity. This theory states that things which share visual characteristics such as shape, size, color, texture, or value will be seen as belonging together in the viewer's mind. Jude Kang's magazine covers use shared typographic systems to ensure a sense of continuity. The title is always in the same place, the issue number is always in the same place, the magazines use the same gray background and always have similar type treatments, overall general shape aesthetic, and color values. Proximity states that objects or shapes that are close to one another appear to form groups. Even if the shapes, sizes, and objects are radically different, they will appear as a group if they are close together. This poster by Micah Barrett separates each quantum of information and scatters them across the page. Still, they remain clear and legible. Closure can be thought of as the glue holding elements together. It's about the human tendency to seek and find patterns. With closure, we combine parts to form a simpler whole. Our eyes fill the missing information. This cover shows a series of words where chunks of the letter are missing, but still on close reading, you can still read it. Or a more simple, the key to closure is providing, let's go back for a second. The key to closure is providing enough information so the eye can fill in the rest. If too much is missing, the elements will be seen as separate parts instead of a whole. If too much information is provided, there's no need for closure to occur. Here's a more basic example of closure. Our eyes see 3 circles with a yellow triangle, as opposed to 3 circles, each with a section removed. Common regions. Common regions, elements are perceived as part of a group if they are located within the same common region. Meaning, if we group objects through some sort of enclosure, we are showing that they are connected. This poster by Jenny Kimamoto uses line and color to establish common regions across the poster in order to make intelligible packets of information. So as you can see, one packet of information is in the top right quadrant, the top left quadrant, the bottom left quadrant, the bottom right quadrant. These common regions are defined by color and by continuity. Speaking of continuity, continuation. With continuation, elements arranged on a line or curve are perceived as more related than elements not on the line or curve. Once you look or move in a particular direction, you continue to look or move in that direction until you see something significant, or you determine there's nothing significant to see. Another interpretation of this principle is that we'll continue our perception of shapes beyond their ending points. The reversed shape gives the eye a sense of continuity and allows us to read the text. Focal point. With focal points, elements with a point of interest, emphasis, or difference will capture and hold the viewer's attention. This principle suggests that our attention will be drawn towards contrast, toward the element that is unlike the others in some way. Like this poster by Ann Mano, where the clear white interior becomes a focal point around the complex bordered area. Similarly, you can consciously avoid a singular focal point if your idea demands that. Past experience is an important one. With past experiences, elements tend to be perceived according to an observer's past experience. For example, when red, green, and yellow are positioned together, we read them as a stoplight. Uniform connectedness. Uniform connectedness states that elements that are visually connected are perceived as more related than elements with no connection. This connection can be through line, color, form, or any other design element. In this image, lines connect 2 pairs of elements. This connection leads us to perceive that the connected elements are related to each other in some way. Back to Jenny Kimamoto's poster, you'll notice continuous lines that cross over folded boundaries between April and 24, between March and 6, and between April and 3. That's all we're going to look at for this week. But for the rest of the class, we're going to be learning some digital tools for creating form. Make sure you have Illustrator installed. In my second video, I will be walking you through the basics of creating and editing shapes in Illustrator. We'll see you all next week.